Hello and welcome back. Last week we spoke of communism, and now we move on to another political philosophy, liberalism. The word is often thrown around without any context. Indeed, in the United States, anyone to the left of Genghis Khan is called liberal. In the UK, a liberal is most often associated with the Liberal Democrats, a socially liberal and often economically conservative party. It is a very distinct political leaning with very indistinct connotations. What I'll try to do is distill the idea of liberalism, how it is different from socialism, and hopefully by the end we'll all understand what it is and what it seeks to do. Initially, when I was first drafting my ideas, I was discussing the concept of dividing liberalism between social and economic liberalism with a friend of mine who identifies as a liberal. The more I attempted to divide social and economic liberalism, the more difficult I found it, because the two sides of it are codependent upon each other, that no matter how we tried to carve it up, it simply went back to the same root. The political philosophy of liberalism is utterly dependent on the economic philosophy of liberalism. Liberalism can also be divided in another way, classical and neo. The neoliberal theory is generally associated with Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan and Milton Friedman, and is typically given to the period from 1979 onwards. Classical liberalism tends to be associated from the mid-17th century to the Second World War. Both have a striking and bold belief in individual freedom, and as we discussed in the video on capitalism, the concept of the invisible hand. The cornerstone of liberal belief can be found in John Locke's writings that all men are endowed with inalienable and natural rights that cannot be violated by the government, rights of life, liberty and property. He believed these rights are derived from a state of nature where every single person has the executive right to protect these rights. He believed that a social contract existed and it was a duty of the government to protect those rights, and in exchange we surrendered that explicit day-to-day executive right of enforcement. Thomas Hobbes expanded on these beliefs and theorized that the state of nature was a horrific place because of that executive right. Uncivilized barbarians, with no check on their power, would do all and sundry as they pleased. He famously stated that the state of nature was a war of all against all, and that the life of man would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So a bit of a downer. This is frequently reflected in our dystopian visions in pop culture, such as zombie apocalypse genres, where armed groups frequently roam the land pillaging. Hobbes believed that for this reason there would need to be some form of supreme authority, and providing the monarch isn't given to abuses of the social contract, a monarch was the only way of ensuring that society doesn't rootlessly devolve into a state of nature. Hobbes was writing shortly after the English Civil War, so it is worth noting that his view was undoubtedly influenced by watching the failure of Charles's government and the failures of the replacement regimes until Cromwell became monarch in all but name. Another key component in liberalism stems from the French political theorist Montesquieu. Montesquieu theorized that society was split into three classes: the monarchy, the aristocracy, and the commons, with two separate types of governmental power, sovereign and administrative. What is relevant here is what he says of those administrative powers, that the administrative is split into the executive, the legislative, and the judicial, which should remain separate from one another to ensure that no one branch controls the government and takes the state into despotism. This was a radical departure from the traditional estates arrangement of feudalistic France, and a major development and influence into the future of political state building. To this very day, we argue over the extent of separation of powers. A good example of this was Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, creating the Supreme Court. Prior to this, the court of last resort domestically was the House of Lords, which was a legislative body. Now the Supreme Court is still staffed by the law lords, but they are prohibited from taking their seat in the House of Lords and legislative matters. This argument pervades to this day. To what extent is the separation of powers appropriate before you enfeeble the government? John Stuart Mill is widely renowned for his magnum opus, On Liberty, which lays out the principles of liberalism quite well, chiefly that where there is no risk of harm, the government has no right to interfere into the lives of the individual. Bear in mind that this was very strongly qualified. Mill wasn't speaking about overt acts of harm, but also acts of harm by omission. He also made the point to say that those who couldn't act on their own behalf were able to be acted for by the government, i.e. children and people of barbarous lands such as India or China. With one hand, he defends the rights of the individual, but with the other justifies colonialism. And this contradiction still exists in many forms today. Mill is a fascinating character, one of the earliest men to openly declare themselves as feminist. He staunchly pushed for equal rights, including attempting to change bills in Parliament to say people instead of men, and was a wide proponent of liberalism and utilitarianism. Lastly, I'd like to talk about Mary Wollstonecraft, who is a personal favourite of mine as a political theorist. Since the feminist movements of the late 80s and early 90s, she has been receiving more attention to her seminal work, A Vindication on the Rights of Women, and it's how I was introduced to her. It is a masterpiece which eviscerates Edmund Burke's criticism of the French Revolution and robustly refutes Talleyrand's report that women should only be partially educated. She thoughtfully declares that women are fully deserving of the same rights as men and should be educated the same. Sadly, due to the social judgment of her time, her relationships led to her obscurity, which is ever the problem with our conception of society. Those who step out are often suppressed. We can take a moment away from our dead theorists and take a look at their ideas, which govern our lives to this very day. Modern society is built upon these ideas in most countries, from Europe, where these ideas are so commonly held as to not be remarked upon, to emerging democratic movements fighting for their right to liberty. If liberalism is this foundational to the modern view of consent of the governed, why then has liberalism declined as a political movement, and now those very concepts come under threat? To understand that, you've got to talk about what happened in the early 20th century. Liberalism was ascendant in the early 20th century, with universal suffrage progressing and the ideas of liberals prevalent in both economics and international relations. Even on the electoral front, classical liberals were pushing their ideas forward. What happened is that liberalism faced challenges from two very specific areas that liberals to this day are unable to out-debate, though they can certainly out-politic at least one of those challenges. Those challenges came from fascism and socialism. Let us tackle the socialist challenge to liberalism first, as it's not only the simplest and easiest to follow, but we've already spoken about socialism, so you've got some understanding. The base premise of liberalism is that if you make sure everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, then your duty to the people is discharged. You don't have an obligation to do anything more, and indeed, doing more would result in social harm. Socialists challenge this with the argument that you cannot be truly free if you don't have economic freedom. Therefore, the government not acting to help people succeed economically is tantamount to allowing people to stay unfree, and therefore, they are not discharging their duty. The fascist challenge to liberalism is a little more complicated. Fascists, like nationalists, are political chameleons. They will say and do anything to support their end goal, and indeed, like nationalism, it's about defining who is the nation and isn't. Fascism works by saying that liberalism has become rootless and harkens back to a storage age that can only be achieved by giving support to the leader, the visionary. Fascists nearly always seek to operate within the state to destroy the state and then remake it. Bear in mind, this isn't reformation or evolution, it is outright destruction. The remaking is never explicitly listed, and it is done deliberately so that they can be seen to engage within the political process. They often seek to provoke and cause violence through symbol rather than outright violence, at least through the official political party. Often they will frame their acts of violence as self-defense against the radical leftists who are trying to destroy the state. These careful, calculated series of acts creates the absurd situation where through gaps in freedom of speech, fascists can walk through minority neighbourhoods calling for the outright destruction of those very communities and are protected by the police from locals who rightly object. The old ideas of liberalism are unable to cope with this challenge because the arch value of liberalism is freedom of speech for the accepted group. To void this cuts at the very heart of liberalism's values and perceived ideas of the world. Liberalism is an inherently utopian view of the human condition in that you and I can disagree, and though one of us may lose, we can remain friends and find a way to prosper despite the government of the day. This does not reflect the view of the world where a political party's policies result in destitution, starvation, and sometimes persecution. Hence the appeal of socialists who say there is no real freedom without economic freedom, and that sometimes your vote simply won't be a point of contention, but a choice between life and death for some of the most vulnerable in society. This conflict is still alive to this very day. Because of this contradiction, liberalism did not survive the Second World War. What did was liberal principles, and this I feel is an interesting point, in that though the framework of liberalism failed, the principles of liberalism did not. The principles of liberalism became essential to our understanding of a modern free society, that there should be free elections with universal enfranchisement, that there should be a wide-ranging freedom of speech with as few restrictions as possible, that some form of meritocracy should be implemented, that separation of powers should occur, that the market should be free. These are all components to fit into a society rather than an overarching system of governance. It is why we use liberal as a suffix rather than just on its own. We talk of liberal democracy or liberal socialism, heck we even talk of liberal communism from time to time. Even in traditional conservative ideology, adherence to these principles of liberalism remains true. What hasn't survived is the overarching framework that unifies liberalism into a coherent political ideology. For example, socialism, despite taking severe knocks in the latter half of the 20th century, remains as a viable political ideology. And I mean viable as in it is more than just a series of principles, but also actively developing policies and ideas, whereas liberalism has become separated into liberal principles and liberalism, the political economic philosophy. For most of the post-war period, we saw these liberal principles applied to a Keynesian mixed economy in the United States, Britain and most of Europe. However, with the oil shocks and the stagflation crisis, we had a radical reorientation around the Thatcher-Reagan consensus, something we now popularly refer to as neoliberalism. What we call neoliberalism is a doubling down on the idea of the market, but crucially, where liberals previously encouraged the wealthy to shore up public works with charitable donations and so forth, the neoliberals believe in none of that. They took the idea of each man being an island to the extreme, to such a degree that the almost cartoonish villain at the time in Gordon Gekko seems like a perfectly average, run-of-the-mill businessman now. Greed is good. The fundamental levers of the economy are no longer used, with tax cuts being the main business of the government and getting out of the way of private enterprise wherever possible. The liberal principles themselves are also compromised, as very often consent of the governed, a key liberal principle, runs contrary to neoliberal economic policies, especially in situations where privatizations are localized. This is also present in places like Chile, where Salvador Allende was assassinated by a CIA-backed coup in favor of Augusto Pinochet, Allende being a leftist whose policies veered too close to socialism. Pinochet implemented the Reagan-Thatcher consensus, and that resulted in Chile suffering a massive divide between have and have not, and that issue persists to this day. The problems with neoliberal agendas spread far and wide, but because it is the consensus, it has constrained political action against it. This has created a divergence in the modern economic consensus. so Third Way Democrats and the 1990s Republican Party, New Labour and the Conservative Party of David Cameron. These groups were all distinct. Let us not fall into the trap of saying that all politicians are the same or that these parties were the same. It is a common and often juvenile assertion from those on the left to make this argument. The only problem, beyond being factually untrue, is that it feeds into the populist narrative of all politicians being corrupt and therefore the entire system needing to be overturned. This nearly always lends itself not towards the left, but the far right, and that causes its own problems. The issue here is that whilst constrained by the economic consensus of our day, the point of policy upon which these parties split most vociferously was social rights. The more right-wing parties, the Republicans and the Conservatives, focused almost exclusively upon economic liberalism without any amelioration of its harder edges, and outside of one or two moments of social liberalism, sought to constrain the free exercise of individual choice, as in the free choice of adults to do as they please within the boundaries of a law. Quite concerningly, the Republicans and Conservatives also sought to crack down on minorities and reduce the boundaries of their free expression in a far harsher way than they have done to other segments of society. The worrying aspect of this is that simultaneously the fascist right have made a sharp resurgence. Obviously, there are historical reasons for this, but there are also some rather unique circumstances, chiefly the triumphalism of liberal values framed as a triumph of liberalism with the fall of the Soviet Union. The Democrats and New Labour sought to manage the system, ameliorate its negative effects while still fitting within the overarching consensus. Naturally, being of a more European tilt, New Labour were far more progressive than the Democrats at the time. Crucially, both sought to pursue social liberalism as the main platform for their electoral push. They are both in many ways falling into classical liberal positions with these aspects. The problem is that both classical and neoliberalism fail utterly at addressing the challenge brought by socialism, chiefly that without economic freedom there can be no individual freedom. And what we are seeing is this exact situation. After the 2008 crash, this is the truth of our situation. People who are increasingly working longer hours for less wages find themselves with less rights and less freedom than our parents and grandparents enjoyed. After all, if you're working all the time and just enough to be broke, when you have time off you're often too exhausted and too poor to really exercise your freedom. The Soviet Union was incredibly authoritarian and totalitarian for much of its existence. How much this is a feature of communism is a different discussion for a different day. However, this was contrasted against the United States' supposed adherence to freedom, as they so often shouted about during the duration of the Cold War. I don't need to point to their actions in South America and the Middle East during this period to show how hollow that cry rings. Even domestically, with things like McCarthyism, the situation is far murkier than the neat division that we would like. However, one key distinguishing point that is valid is that liberal principles were present in the United States and much of Western Europe at this time, whereas those principles were absent in the Soviet Union and other aligned states. When the Soviet Union fell, here there was a great degree of triumphalism, with Francis Fukuyama famously proclaiming liberal democracy as in the Reagan-Thatcher interpretation of liberalism within a democracy as being the end of history, that we have, as Cell in Dragon Ball Z would say, reached our perfect form. Unfortunately, he, like many people, were very, very wrong. Liberalism reached the end of its intellectual road during the Great Depression, when faced by simultaneous pressures from socialism and fascism while contending with the largest economic crisis in history. The response was to divorce liberal principles from liberalism and then allow the ideas to continue on and become amalgamated into our way of doing things. It was accepted that all forms of political ideologies within the mainstream should adhere to these principles. However, with the resurgence of liberalism in the political system, those very principles are now being challenged by fascists subverting the system and socialists querying if it can even work. When you have Donald Trump in the United States and Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom showing clearly that the separation of powers has not worked as it should have, people are rightly asking, how do we fix this? When Nazis are marching in the streets calling for genocide, often openly, this demonstrates that the limits of free speech have been reached. Liberalism's response, mostly through centrist perspectives, has been to double down on those very principles and talk about going back to the normal way of doing things, without realising the normal way of doing things is what led to these problems arising in the first place. Part of the issue is that liberalism depends utterly upon capitalism. They are almost impossible to separate because one of the core principles of liberalism is the freer the market, the freer the individual. As I've said repeatedly, this sadly doesn't hold true, and in the modern age where corporations have such an immense amount of power, this is doubly untrue. Capitalism is an inherently contradictory method of governance. You need just the right amount of inequality, but the inherent trend is to continually increase that inequality to increase efficiency. It is a stark and difficult system that often has some very real, very harsh consequences. Failure to account for those consequences renders liberal rhetoric shallow. For most of the early 20th century, despite the inherent contradictions, things were improving because liberals proactively acted in the public interest and encouraged wealthy individuals to do the same. Today, there is no such attempt to try and soften the edges. If anything, the sharp edges are seen as the privilege of the rich. Even under traditional liberal thought, raising taxes was okay to balance the books if necessary. To modern neoliberalism, the very idea of taxes are an anathema. As George Osborne, the then Chancellor of the United Kingdom, famously stated, the Conservatives believe in a low tax, low welfare, high wage economy. The only problem is that, as the Library of Congress has found, that tax cuts almost always benefit the wealthiest people and not the average person, and that tax cuts for corporations seldom result in wage rises, just higher profits. When a politician continually promises prosperity to accompany tax cuts and the situation of the average person continues to decline, the services in their local area continues to decline, and their cost of living continues to rise, that person loses trust and faith in the political system, and they start looking at alternatives. In the current economic situation, that nearly always lends itself towards populism and eventually fascism. It is very telling that after repeatedly electing Conservative legislatures focused on tax cuts and budget balancing, that around a decade after an earth-shattering economic crisis, both the United States and the United Kingdom are becoming increasingly unstable, with elected heads of government that are known liars and completely incompetent, with at the very least proto-fascist tendencies. Both of these individuals have exploited that lack of certainty with simplistic, repetitive messaging that seeks to devalue political conversation and discourage traditional political virtues of clarity, open communication, and honesty. This ties in with the incredibly worrying pattern of liberals when faced between a choice of illiberal, almost fascistic conservatives and more socialist options, nearly always voting towards the illiberal and the fascist. The election of Boris Johnson stands as a worrying point in which the socially liberal and economically conservative Cameronites voted for the Conservatives over Labour or even the Liberal Democrats. With Donald Trump, you've had supposedly get the government out of our lives Republicans voting for a man who promised and has delivered authoritarianism. As the United States strays ever closer towards outright, unashamed fascism, will those Republicans vote and stay with the fascist? As a demographic breakdown showed, white voters stayed with Trump, Republican voters stayed with Trump. Increased turnout amongst minority voters carried the Democrats to victory, and even then, the Democrats lost ground in the down-ticket races. Liberalism and liberal principles are now in crisis because those who have exploited them for their own profit no longer need to pretend to adhere to them. Brexit is done. It doesn't matter that laws were broken and the democratic process violated. Donald Trump is president. It doesn't matter that all manner of electoral rules were broken and the very integrity of our information violated. Other political philosophies are rightly asking, why adhere to all these systems if when push came to shove, they failed to do their job and prevent these people from taking office and brazenly destroying the democratic rule of law. President-elect Joe Biden campaigned and won on restoring decency, but that Pandora's box has now been opened. When I first drafted this episode, prior to the election, I questioned whether Republicans would be content to rejoin the political process as liberals see it, and I highly doubted it. Their actions since the election have not assuaged my concerns in that Trump is actively moving to deny the result and attempt to stay in office. My worry then was that he had enough fanatics to do it, and nothing I've seen in the time since has reduced this worry. Liberal principles in the United States have failed at checking Trump's exercise of power, and the only thing that's prevented the United States from dissolving into outright fascism is the fact that Donald Trump is an idiot who is so incredibly incompetent that he doesn't know how to exercise his power. In Britain, Boris Johnson faces very few checks on his exercise of power, despite being shown to be frankly criminally negligent on his handling of COVID and recently stating that he and his party are okay with breaking the law to deliver his unicorn Brexit. At every point, the political process is breaking and liberalism has no answers, not even a hint of a clue to how we fix this. It is a philosophy that may have worked once, may have been radical once, and may have been good once, but now it is simply the convenient way to enable the worst of us. The most terrifying aspect of all of this is that we still don't have the answer for how we replace the liberal principles and frameworks in a way that doesn't dissolve into anarchy and authoritarianism. So on that rather grim note, I'll end it here. I'd love to see your thoughts in the comments. It was a pleasure having you here for this, and hopefully I'll see you next week when we go into everyone's favourite punching bag, libertarianism.